The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, the program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today, award-winning author Barry Lopez, will be talking about his book Crow and Weasel and its adaptation into the 1994 Children's Theatre Company production. Barry, it's a pleasure to have you here today on All About Kids.
Thank you.
And rather than talking about you primarily as an author and essayist, I'd like to talk a little bit about Barry Lopez, the playwright. You're working in the early winter of 1994 with the Children's Theatre Company,
yes.
And your beautifully illustrated and beautifully written book, Crow and Weasel, is about to be mounted as a winter-spring production.
Yes, it is. You flatter me to call me a playwright. The playwright who has adapted the book is a man named Jim Leonard, and Jim and I have worked very closely together to adapt the book to the stage because it presented unusual problems. The book grows out of my own background in traveling with indigenous people, and that wasn't something that Jim could add to his repertoire overnight, so we had to work together. And the process for me has been more interesting and exciting than I thought it would be, because I'm learning about a place I've not been before, which is the theater, and how to take a story like this out of a book and put it on a stage where you don't. I used to think that the question I dreaded with Crow and Weasel was when people said, well, now are these people or are they animals? And the clever and smart answer, I guess, to that is yes. And what I've begun to feel uncomfortable about is anticipating the question of whether or not the stage production is like the book or does justice to the book. And what I keep thinking is, we all read the book, and then we put it down, and then we turned to the stage, and we made something on the stage. And the incidents and the characters all translate very well to the stage, I think. But we've had to make adjustments because we're working in a different medium. And I think that the stage production is very much in the spirit of the book, and it's a very close parallel. There's no new character or new situation or something that gets introduced.
I think that's something we always appreciate about Children's Theatre Company. They inevitably remain
faithful.
Very true and faithful,
yes,
to the intent of the book. It would compromise their standards, I think, if they took your book and made it into something that was glitzy or different.
Well, I would feel compromised, but they haven't been like that at all. And I have been actually tremendously impressed by the thoroughness of the preparation for the production in every area, in costumes and props, and working on the play with Jim, talking with the director, Gary Gisselman. We've been talking back and forth for more than a year now. Lots of phone calls. We worked at Sundance at Robert Redford's place in
Well, originally
Utah.
That's where Crow and Weasel was
Yes.
translated into theater.
Yes, it was. And Mr. Redford had bought the stage rights to Crow and Weasel, and we began to develop it there in summer workshops. And then the Children's Theatre expressed an interest in co-production, and Sundance Children's Theatre was very interested in doing that because this is, I think, generally regarded as the best children's theatre in the country, and to have them say, we're interested in working with you and co-producing, the people at Sundance said that'd be great. So that's what brought us here.
Well, that's exciting, and the book is about indigenous peoples, but it's very symbolic. It's very, you mentioned that this came out of a long-time interest in Plains, Native Americans, Plains Indians?
Let me see how to say this. I had a fairly conventional life through graduation from a university, in the sense that I was exposed to the kinds of things that that many of us are exposed to. I went to a conventional high school and a university and whatnot, and all of those ideas that I was exposed to, which I was thrilled by. I loved school. I began to feel somewhere with 17, 18, 19 years old that something was missing, that I wanted to know something that I wasn't learning in school. And when I got out of graduate school, I was feeling around in the dark for that. What was it? And what it turned out to be was to see the world in a way different from the way I was taught to see the world.
So a sense of adventure, too.
Well, it turned into it turned into adventure. There's no doubt about that. But I guess the most succinct way to say this is that when I was a child, I knew there was something magical about animals, not just a kind of cartoon magic, but something deep and mysterious and unknown about animals. And I responded to it as a child. And throughout my education, which was very good, I never learned anything that took that idea away. And when I graduated, one of the things that I was looking for was a time with people who saw animals in the way that I saw them. And when I began traveling with Eskimos and with indigenous people in North America and later in Australia and in Africa, I felt very comfortable in a world with people who saw the world more the way I did as a child. And where that left me as a writer was with a certain kind of education and language and respect for Western ideas, and as profound a respect for ideas that come from other cultures. And in a simplistic way, I guess you can say that's part of what Crow and Weasel is about. There's two young men who leave their village and make a long journey, and they discover each other on that journey. They discover the importance of friendship, or actually companionship probably, as a sustaining force in life, a sustaining and needed social dimension to our lives. And they also discover things that are unlike anything they'd ever heard of, and then they bring those stories back to their people. So their journey, in a sort of in a very simplified way, has been my journey. I can find myself emotionally, I think, easily in this story.
I think almost every reader certainly would. I know when I was reading it, two young men setting out with a great sense of adventure and almost bravado.
Yes.
And having to overcome obstacles, whether nature or whether fear of the unknown, meeting people who are different, and being apprehensive, but then because they respected the others, gradually becoming accepted. It's a wonderful myth.
Well, it's I think it's a story that people are very comfortable with because there's nothing complicated about it. When the book first came out, people said, well, we don't know if this is a children's book or this is a book for adults. And when I would go into bookstores, I would watch, where people shelved the book. Did it go into the children's section, or did it go into fiction, or did it go on a shelf with other books of mine, or did it end up in Native American studies, or did it end up in mythology? And it ended up in all of those places. But I think that I didn't sit down to write a so-called children's book. I don't think I have the skill to do that. That, like writing plays or writing film scripts, to write books for children is a highly skilled, they're technical skills that I just don't have. And I would never pretend to say, oh, because I wrote this book, I can sit down and write a book. I mean, that's a joke among many writers, that people say, I want to become a writer, I think I'll start out by writing children's books. And it doesn't occur to them that it doesn't work like that. You have to be very good to write well for children. What I was trying to do was tell a story in the way I had heard stories told in contexts in villages where you couldn't tell the older people or the younger people to go to bed or go play somewhere. The story had to be told in such a way that everyone got something from it and no one felt excluded. And in the end, I think the way that I wrote Crow and Weasel was there's no irony in it. There's no place in the story where a child would feel something's going on, I don't know what it is, but I shouldn't be here, or this is over my head. It's very straightforward. And in that sense, it's a children's book because children are not excluded. No, there's nothing in the book that says, you can't be here. And there are a word here or a word there that an adult or a child might have to look up in the dictionary or something. But the experience, I think, of reading for a 10-year-old or a 50-year-old or an 80-year-old person, they just bring more experience to the story. And if the story's told well, the 10-year-old will come away from it with a sense of fullness, and a person who has 80 years of experience will come away with fullness. And an 80-year-old and an 80-year-old can talk to each other, but the 80-year-old and the 10-year-old will have something to say to each other. I hope when people walk out of the theater or when they finish reading the book, that what they feel is a renewed sense of their own worth and their own possibilities, the possibilities for them and their families and their communities, and I guess a feeling that for example, if a mother and a father and two children go to the theater and see this play, I think that they can walk out of the theater and the children will have a way to share something that's very exciting to them. And the mother and father can lie awake that night in bed and talk about the play and some more subtle or complicated issues in the play that the children wouldn't be interested in, maybe. And then at breakfast the next morning, all four of them can talk about a common experience. So that what's most important to me is that children feel that what engages them is also interesting for their parents. And I think it's very soothing and comforting for parents to know that they're engaged in something that's exciting to them and meaningful to their children. Then there's some way for all of them to connect and understand what it means to be a family. That there is a common experience that can be deep and exciting in the theater or in film or in books.
Or through reading a book. Certainly this would be a book that would make a wonderful read aloud. And I think that exact sense comes through after reading the book. Crow and Weasel discover that they are best friends. They talk about their children going off on a quest or an adventure like this. When they come back, the thing that I thought was quite amazing was that you just don't blurt out the story. There is a wisdom that comes from thinking about it, from understanding the audience that you're going to be sharing it with, and it's something that I don't think we think about enough today, that maybe we do need to think more before we talk. It's important to let experiences settle a little bit before we write or describe them in this age of instant talk show analysis where people just talk off the top of their head.
Well, I remember when I was writing the story and I discovered this character whose name is Badger. She is the first person that Crow and Weasel meet. They make this very long journey north, as you know, and meet the Inuit people and spend several weeks with them, listening to their stories and talking to them. And then when the first person they meet when they return, or they begin their homeward journey, is Badger. And in essence, what Badger tells them is that it's not enough to have done something extraordinary. You must say well what it was that you did. Otherwise, your people won't have the benefit of the knowledge that you gained. And the idea behind that is that the story is often a container for more wisdom than the storyteller can manage to be articulate about. I would say that that is true for me as a writer, that you strive to write a story that has such depth that you can't yourself explain it. The writer, I never think of the writer as the wise person. The wise person is that or this or the other reader. I mean, readers bring a kind of intelligence to a good story. The range of it is such that I think any writer can learn something new about a story that he or she has written by listening to an articulate reader say, here's what I saw, here's what I felt. And I think it's the same with the theatrical production at the Children's Theater. I sit in the house every day with the director and the playwright, and as these scenes develop and as the play itself develops, I have insights into the story that I never would have had I not worked with this group of people. It's not as though they were things that I didn't know. they were things that I knew but had no language for, and couldn't have talked articulately about unless somebody else said, "Did you notice this strain that goes all the way through the story?" And then I can say, "Yes, now I see it."
And when your story is translated into theater, do you find some things coming out in body language and the way the actors move, or just the expressions?
I think that probably among the difficult things for me as a prose writer, watching the play or watching the book become a play, is learning that language does a different thing on the stage than it does in a book. A character I must write a line of prose to carry an idea, but when you're on the stage, you can sometimes take that language and just set it aside, and the actor can make a movement or a facial gesture that carries that line and makes the line in the book redundant. You just don't need it. So the process probably of writing the play has been stripping away more and more language and turning more and more language into movement, and then getting that down to a sort of bare bones, and then letting the actors bring out of that language everything that you hope you've packed into it.
Must be very exciting. The illustrations, of course, by Tom Port play a very important role in your book. How are they translating into theater?
The translation is stunning. The costume designer has managed to get pretty much the look of Tom Port's watercolors onto the stage, with masks and costumes. They are oddly, or maybe not oddly, I didn't understand the costume sketches when I first saw them. I mean, I couldn't read them in motion. I looked at them as static, and I wondered how they were going to work on the stage. But once the actors had their costumes and their masks and they began moving on stage, I saw that this was part of the magic of theater. That this question that bothers me is when people say, are they animals or are they people, has been carried successfully to the stage. At the heart of Crow and Weasel, I think, are issues of let me see how to say this, but the story addresses the issue of prejudice in a very straightforward way. What Crow and Weasel discover is that which is different from them, and instead of arranging that knowledge in a hierarchical framework, the way we say, we'll put whites here and black people here, we'll put women here and we'll put men here, we'll put children here and older people here and middle-aged people here, or we'll put the United States of America here at the top and we'll put this nation over here at the bottom, or we'll say this is a first world and that's a third world nation. Instead of arranging our feelings about that which is different from us in those hierarchies and grading everybody the way we're wont to do, Crow and Weasel discover a sense of, I think, genuine equality with the world. They realize finally that mystery is in everything, and that no person, no event, no culture can be summarized in the equivalent of a bumper sticker. And because they discover that, because that's part of what they're discovering, the issue of whether the person that you see is an animal or a human being becomes irrelevant, because what you're looking at is the tendency to say, if they're human beings, then I'll have these sort of feelings about the story, but if they're animals, I'll have these sorts of feelings about the story. And that's the same to me as saying, well, if these are events that occurred to black people, I'll feel one way about it, but if they occurred to white people, I'll feel another way about it. Now we know that is a frame of mind that is cruel and destructive, and we have a terrible history of this stuff, and we don't know how to get it out of our systems. I think it's one of the basic problems in trying to create a pluralistic society or a democracy, is trying to create and sustain an environment in which a person will never feel, because of race or color or religious or cultural background, that they cannot achieve a full expression of their personality. that what it is that they wish to do, the gift that they wish to offer the community, is acceptable, no matter what it is that they have, where it is that they have come from, or what color they are, or whether they are conventionally beautiful or plain. When you see these costumes on the stage, the way the actors use the masks and the costumes, it's very hard to sit there in the audience and say, oh, well, that's a person, or no, maybe that's an animal. And what we've learned sitting in the house is if you sit in the first row, or you sit at the back of the theater, or you sit house right, or you sit house left, you get different images of the play. In certain moments when the characters are talking to each other, from up in the back of the house, it looks like they're animals talking to each other. In the front row, it looks like they're people talking to each other. And that kind of confusion is something that is intentional on our part.
That would be very exciting, and that would lead to discussion too. I think this does come across very, very clearly in the book, because the whole environment you mentioned a moment ago, the oneness with nature, what happens when you don't give proper thanks for killing the caribou,
yes,
or getting food, or being rescued. Again, the growing wisdom as Crow and Weasel understand that they're not out there alone, they're not doing it themselves, it's taking their horses.
Yes.
Which certainly are animals in the play, but you have to it sounds a little dumb to say respect the horseness, but that's kind of...
Actually, you know, that's what we have, that's one thing that we've been doing in these last few days of trying to understand the play and get it up on the stage is to figure out the horses. When Jim Leonard and I first met at Sundance, the first thing that we said to each other after we sort of intuitively recognized a respect and an affection for each other was, what are we going to do about the horses? How are you going to get these horses, which are such an important part of the journey, onto the stage? And Jim and I talked around and around and around about this for several hours, never got anywhere. Then I picked the phone up and called Tom Port, the illustrator, and I said, Tommy, can you talk to me about this? Can you imagine how to do this? And he said, well, we could use effigy horses. And then I remembered that Lakota people have horses that they're stretched out as though they were galloping wooden horses about 4 feet long with manes and tails, and that Lakota people use those horses to tell stories about their traveling, to represent the horse. That's how they move them around. Those are Crow and Weasel's horses. So that's the way we started to approach it on the stage, with effigy horses. But as the play is developed, we've seen places where the horses can do things on their own. And so I'm hopeful that the audience will sit there and say, huh, I wonder what the horses are thinking about all the while that these two guys are traveling. That was on my mind when I was writing the book. I know people read the book and realize that there are 4 beings on this journey, Crow and Weasel, whom we pay attention to a lot, and then these 2 horses. And that's why that line is there at the end of the book when Crow and Weasel are standing there. They've come back to their village, and Crow turns to Weasel and says, look at that, look how the other horses are following our horses around. So you can easily imagine that these 2 horses made this long journey, and they came back into this herd of horses, and all the other horses came up and said, where have you been? What did you do? And these other 2 horses said, well, you know, they got set, and then they were going to tell their stories too. And their stories were a little riskier even than Crow and Weasel's. So. Yes, they had their own problems, their own troubles. And it's not a thing that I decided, but I realized halfway through the story how much I liked the idea that Crow and Weasel in their naivete had chosen 2 horses that were young and inexperienced. And so on the journey back, where an older horse would have measured its pace a little better and been stronger, they were stuck with 2 horses that were in some ways just as inexperienced as they were. So there was the 4 young beings, you know, fighting their way home and trying to protect each other. And the way that the Children's Theater has staged some of those moments to me are so beautiful, with the actor who represents the effigy horse holding the effigy horse has a hand in the back of Crow, for example, during the snowstorm. And you can see that Crow is starving and so weak that he's going to fall out of the saddle. And it's his horse that is holding him up visually. And it's a beautiful moment because these silent horses you see are have developed an affection for their riders and a sense of their own determination to get everybody home. And it's what makes it so dark a moment when Crow and Weasel are starving to death and they realize the only way out of this dilemma is to kill one of the horses. It's the only food that they have. And, you know, that leads them someplace else in the story. But
fortunately, there is.
Fortunately, yes, right.
Grizzly bear. We've just got a couple of minutes left, but talk a little bit about the music, please. I understand that
the music the music was created by a composer named John Luther Adams, and I've known John for years. We first met in Alaska about 10 years ago. I mean, this is a personal opinion, but I think John's music is brilliant and it is unique. John has apprenticed himself, I would say, for years to indigenous people, principally to Koyukon Athabascan people in the interior of Alaska and to Eskimo people on the coast, Inupiat people on the coast of Alaska, and developed a music that's not, that recapitulates or recreates some of the rhythms that are in their music. And the music that he's created for the play is what John calls sometimes a sonic geography. It's his feeling that we live in a landscape that is also defined orally as well as visually. And what he's tried to create is a music about place, so that the music is part of what carries us on our journey. And when we hear birds and other animals, you hear them in the music. You don't hear a live goose call. What you hear is, yeah, we hear piccolo and bass clarinet and clarinet, and as you would in Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf or something like that. It's a similar kind of thing. But it's when we stand back from it, the ideas that have brought this to the stage have been, until before it got to the children's theater, were ones that Jim Leonard, the playwright, and myself and John Adams talked about extensively. And we always saw the stage production as about a third language and about a third of movement, and about a third of it is John's music. So that's how we saw the package unfolding on stage.
Sounds like a beautifully, wonderfully integrated.
Well, we hope. It is, there are several times during rehearsals where I've been sitting by myself in the house and felt the tears settle up on the bottom of my eyes, because the scene that had been created was so touching. It was so beautiful, so human.
I look forward to seeing this, Barry Lopez. Thank you for being with us today.
Gretchen. Thank you.
Crow and Weasel, a book and a production that will interest children and adults. Thank you, Barry Lopez, and thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency.